You're listening to the Veteran Etc. podcast, as there's always more to be said about a veteran. Join your host, Mike Kim, a veteran, ex-monk, seasoned war trauma therapist, and writer, as he shares his years of research in veteran readjustment culture and the meaning of warrior life. Now, here's your host, Mike Kim.
Veteran Etc. This is a show dedicated towards not just veteran culture, but veteran readjustment culture. I'm your host, Mike Kim, and I've been researching veterans since the 90s, and I've come across not just expressions, artifacts, and documents and other expressions in American life, in American daily life, that deal with veteran culture, but I've also come across veteran readjustment and how that affects the daily lives of veterans, and how important it is for us to observe what is happening in the readjustment of veterans. Today, on this episode, we have Derick Varn. Derick Varn is highly regarded media, public intellectual. I would say on many levels has influenced me in social media, has vast experience in the areas of foreign policy, history, cultural studies, very interdisciplinary approach towards looking at the world. And today we're going to be looking at the TV, what am I saying? Not the TV, but the audio podcast Blowback, dealing with the Korean War. And the reason why I said TV earlier is because every time I think about military history or military affairs, I think about the History Channel. I think it's a great thing to have that, but it's also great to have other things. And for me, checking out Varn Vlog, and getting a great dose of different personalities who are there to understand different things happening in the world is just the value towards truly becoming informed. So welcome, Derick.
Hi, how you doing?
Great. And so I went through that lengthy introduction. Is there anything that you can add to that?
Well, there's a lot to talk about on this specific topic. While I am Caucasian, for those of you who have seen me on the show, I have Korean family. My grandfather fought in the U.S. military in the Korean War. My uncle fought in the Vietnam War and was proximally stationed in Korea and worked with Korean units that worked with the U.S. military in the war. I was in Korea during the Yeongpong Island incident in 2011, I believe.
Ferry incident?
Huh? Not the ferry incident. The shooting on Yeongpong Island, which is a year after the ferry, which accelerated tensions right before the transfer of power.
Wow.
From Kim Jong-il to Kim Jong-un. So there is a lot there. My cousins served in the U.S. military. They're half Korean, and were stationed as translators primarily, but that wasn't their own, also military intelligence. And I believe in Kunsan, in South Korea. And I am a scholar of, my training formally actually is in pedagogy and literary analysis and anthropology. But I've been working in media now for 11 years, and I am railroad in history. and I have the distinct advantage of having rudimentary Korean under my belt as a language, so it's helpful for these things. I have been incredibly frustrated with the way the Korean War is talked about. And when we were listening, you asked me to listen to the introduction podcast for this Blowback, because the main series is 10 episodes long and it's behind a paywall. I know, however, the scholars that they were invoking, so I actually am tangentially, I know a person who knows Susie Kim, who's one of the main scholars on the history of the Haebong period, or the liberation period of North Korea. I also am familiar with Bruce Cummings, who is a military scholar, and whose book on this I think is probably the most fair.
Yes.
And it actually does try to put into context the specific reasons why there was a feedback loop between U.S. actions, and particularly with MacArthur, and North Korean intransigence. I found the Blowback framing of the issue to be quite good for a show aimed at Americans. Definitely slightly left leaning, but I don't, so, I mean, for people who in your audience, so am I. But what I would say is, even though it was purporting to get beyond the American narrative of the forgotten war, and to some degree I think it does, it still seemed to not entirely understand the Korean context of what was going on, which is fair, because that's very hard to do from the American standpoint. The history of Korea is complicated. It's even in the name Korea, which refers to the Goryeo, which is corrupted into Korea. That particular nation has not existed for like 700 years. The nation that we think of as Korea is, as we talk about pre-Japanese Imperial Korea, was the Choson kingdom, and then once it declines, the Great Han Empire, which is an ironic name because it was neither great nor an empire, really. And it really only existed for about 30 years, and it was ended in the Battle of Incheon in the Russo-Japanese War, of which Korea was kind of given to the Japanese as a consolation prize under the auspices of Teddy Roosevelt, which began the Japanese occupation of Korea. One of the tensions that started fomenting the divide between the North and the South before the rule of Syngman Rhee are
it's the first president of Korea that was put into office by the U.S.
He was a U.S.-backed dictator. He was educated in Ivy League schools.
Let me interrupt you because Derick, because our audience, I'm going to go in at times to interrupt you because you have such a familiarity with Korea, just like like you knew that you were part of that one incident, or you were there during that one incident, and I connected it to the ferry. That just shows you that you're more Korean than I am, even though I would definitely say that when it comes to military tactics and stuff, I have the unfair advantage, even though you would probably figure it out, some of the different things.
Yeah,
that
I could talk about John Boyd all day, but yes.
Yeah, no, but you follow it because we did that one Varn blog episode of yours, which was very well received. I was honored to be part of your show on Korea, and you could check that out, Varn vlog all of his shows. They're just a wealth of knowledge with incredible guests. But on the Korea episode, I was surprised that you knew more about military history than I would say a lot of my peers. And just to let folks know, I'm part Korean. My family, like Varn's, like Derick Varn's family, also served in Korea. My father's Korean. My grandfather was part of Manchurian, part of the Korean labor sent to Manchuria during the Japanese occupation, and I had family members that served in Vietnam, part of the Korean Army. The thing is that Derick is a incredible resource, and when I interrupt, it's just to fill in, to let viewers know, because I know the audience, and to give them kind of a little bit of background. So go ahead. I'm sorry. So you were saying about the why it's important, the North Korean, South Korean, before that fight truly ignites, something to deal with the Japanese. Is that what you were?
Well, what happens is the Korea is more or less given to Japan as a consolation prize. I mean, I shouldn't. Maybe that's unfair, but as a settlement condition of the Russo-Japanese War. So the Koreans, the Han Empire, which, like I said, is a country that didn't exist for very long, barely a generation, gets caught up in just being a territory over which the Tsarist Russians, so we're well before the Russian Revolution even, and Japan are fighting. And during the settlement of that war, the occupation of Korea by Japan is recognized by the Western powers under, I believe, Teddy Roosevelt's auspices. And so that really begins to set up the situation that we have now. The idea, for example, of a Korean race enters from Japan at this time, as opposed to Korean culture.
Series doesn't go into that. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, yeah. So there's this idea called there's the Minjung, which is like popular, but it turns into the Minyok, which is a kind of, it's a term that a Korean anarchist nationalist, its own weird thing, comes up with in writing a kind of unifying history of the Korean peoples. Korea had gone in and out of being one country several times in its 6,000-year history, and many times even in the last 1,000. And during the end of the Choson dynasty, it began to be carved up. Part of what is now far southeastern China, and in an area that's in English would be called the Korean Autonomous Zone, was taken by believe the Qing, the last imperial dynasty of China, and incorporated into the Chinese nations. That began the carving up of Korean territory in what we would probably call the modern period. So we're dealing with, like, shortly after the establishment of the United States as an independent country.
And then, do you think? And I'm glad the viewers get that, because I knew about that, but I didn't know the timeline, and so that's really interesting that you mentioned as the United States is being formed. That I didn't know that, so that's very interesting that that's happening with the North and South. That's almost like an artificial, right? I mean, I got from like.
So
okay.
This is what's complicated.
Yeah.
The 36th parallel is artificial. It's imposed at the end of World War II in joint settlements between Stalin and the United States. There was a feeling in in the USSR at the time that the kind of united front and co-management of the world would be maintained with the U.S. For a brief period of time. So while the USSR, from its perspective, was fighting U.S. imperialism, it saw it as a progressive bourgeois power that it could negotiate with. And so they jointly imposed that line. But there were already tensions forming before them between the North and the South, one of which has to do with religion. So now
That's
there are
something that's not really engaged in the show, which is even today, a very, very important within Korean culture. So yeah, can you go on with that?
So one of the reasons why there is a difference is that there's a lot of aristocracy around the southern capital, around what we would call Insadong in Seoul, which is kind of one of the historical capitals. Pyongyang is another historical capital.
What are the other ones? The show didn't go into that.
Pyongyang and Insadong. It's also been in Suwon in certain times of crisis, which is a kind of mid-sized city just to the southeast of Seoul. So the reason why this is contested is the Chosun dynasty kind of moved its rulership around in several places, and one of the ironies of the situation in the north is there's both an attempt to break with the historical lineage of Korea, and that's explicit in its reversal of Confucian gender norms and the way it talks about itself. You switch from fatherland to motherland and stuff like that. But it's also wanting to claim legitimacy as an extension of the Chosun dynasty and culture. So, for example, in Korean, the name for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea should probably actually be translated, if it was translated literally, the Democratic People's Republic of Chosun. Mm-hmm. Whereas the Republic of Korea, its name in Korean is the Republic of the Han, which ties it to the later state I'm mentioning, which is the state that's destroyed in the Russo-Japanese War. Mm. Why does that matter? And part of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the Buddhist population of Korea, which was more focused in the South, even though I think now Buddhism is a larger religion in North Korea than Christianity, there were more North Korean Christians, particularly amongst the peasants, during the 18th and 19th century, when the Matteo Ricci and his missionaries left China. They sent delegations to Korea and were much more positively received there. So there had been a Korean Catholic movement in the Korean Peninsula for 400 years by the beginning of the 20th century.
Saint Andrew Kim, right?
Right. And so, and this is important because it's one of the things that complicates the narrative that you hear around there being it being totally imposed from the outside. What happens, however, is during the 1950s, a lot of the Christians exile themselves to Seoul, and because there's 4 approved, and I don't remember when they are formally approved, but there are 4 approved Christian churches in North Korea, and all others are disapproved and effectively banned. And so you have a mass migration of Christians from the north to the south, if they can get there, before everything really shuts down. I think this is actually before the formalization of the war. But that was a strong cultural difference And it mattered because a lot of the Buddhists, the Sun Buddhists who Sun is the Korean word for Chan, which is, we know in English from its Japanese counterpoint, Sin. They were seen by many of the people who followed Korean traditional religions, by Korean Christians. The Korean traditional religions, I think, in English, we might call it Korean shamanism, although that's kind of a misnomer. They were seen as potential Japanese collaborators. So there's that tension there. That tension is still actually in South Korean politics to this day. There's a tension between Buddhist conservatives and Christian conservatives that is very hard for Westerners to understand. So that role still plays out.
And I think that fills in the gap where in the show, these guys talk about that the Korean War, to a certain extent, is just, it has the Americans as kind of like the Japanese, but like, kind of the same tensions that the Americans support the Koreans, or set up a system very similar to the Japanese. And so like the police and the military are still pretty much like the Japanese influence. There's no changes. And like what you're saying adds to the tension as far as, right, the religion is like, oh, you're Japanese because, or you're a Japanese sympathizer, occupation sympathizer, right, because of this, or you're that, right? Can you go into more detail?
Well, there's a lot more detail to that. So one of the things with the Japanese tensions that you really have to consider is modern Korea's administrative structure to this day, even after its democratic revolution in the early 1980s, by the way, guys, it happens much later than people think. South Korea, I mean, is its administrative structure, its language, etc., is different from the North because, for example, the North has much more loan words from, one, it tries to keep its Korean pure, whatever that means, and two, in so much as it does have loan words, they're from Russian and from Chinese, which you would expect. And this even shows up in like beer culture in the Koreas. So like North Korean beer is actually better than South Korean beer because North Koreans learn how to make beer from Russians, and South Koreans learned how to make beer from Americans, which is, to put it vulgarly, but it's stuff like that. There's little touches of culture where it shows up in South Korean language. Now there's a lot of loan words from English, what we would call like Konglish in South Korean. There's lots of loan words from Japanese, and there's lots of loan words from German, which come through the Japanese.
Father learned German in his college class.
Yeah.
So that's interesting during the occupation.
Yeah. So, and so we talked a little bit. I mentioned the Korean anarchist. This figure is a key figure to both South and North culture to this day. He's kind of.
I interrupted you, so tell us how that is also tied to the war and now, tensions now.
Well, one of the things that's interesting about the Korean situation is that Korean, for lack of a better term, racialism, even though it pulls from categories from Germany and Japan explicitly, I mean, and this does come from the Axis time period, it was set up to actually create a unified identity to fight off the Japanese. So it was kind of a use the master's tool sort of situation. The word that is entered into the Korean language, and you'll hear it in modern Korean, and it's retrojected back into the past in TV dramas and stuff in the South, is minyeok, which I mentioned. But that word does not, you don't find that word in Korean until the 20th century in any document. Even though if you were to go to Korean historical TV shows, they're always mentioning it. And that is this idea of a Korean biological race. as opposed to a cultural ethnic zone. Like Korea, the Korean culture under Choson was very Confucian, and it was very internal, very skeptical of outsiders, because it was fought over and attempted to be conquered by the Chinese or the Japanese over and over again historically. So I think, the idea of the very unified but very isolated Korean culture, which we associate with the North, I think it should be associated with both countries, honestly. I think is the result of constantly being on the, well, crap, there's people coming over the hill and they're going to try to take our land. And I think that mentality is in both countries to some degree, and I think it's historically situated and justifiable. And the tension towards the United States in the North, which I want people to really contextualize, because I don't want to say there's a reason why they hate our freedom, but there's a reason why they hate our freedom. Because for them, and in what they saw in the South, the United States backed two consecutive dictatorships, the Reed dictatorship and the Park dictatorship. The Reed dictatorship was a thorn, in the side of the American planners, because it was too nationalistic even for their ends. But since Reed was educated in the United States during Wilson's period, and since he was sympathetic to anti-communism, despite the fact he had, I think the descriptor that was given on Blowback is accurate, that he was somewhere between Mussolini and Chiang Kai-shek in his ideology. That he was seen as kind of a necessary evil, because at least he understood us and we could work with him to fight the communists. However, one of the things that makes North Korea kind of what you might call a barrack state, a very isolated state, is that while it appealed to China during the Korean War for backup as things escalated, and received help, and then was protected under the Soviet nuclear umbrella, it during the early 1950s, Kim Il-sung was actively purging both pro-Chinese and pro-Russian communists, and developing the idea of juche, which means self-reliance. This is not a new, people think this is a new ideology. It's not. It is absolutely not. It's an old word. It becomes it's part of even the South's resistance movement to Japan, which is, we can't count on others. The Americans betrayed us to the Japanese anyway. And this is, like I said, this is in the teens and 20s. So they already have a hostility to the US for brokering a deal with two countries which subjugated their country to Japan, of which they had no control, and of which they were not even a party to the war.
And they're on this racial steroids, not racist, but racializing on steroids that you describe. So on top of all of that, you've got a perfect explosion ready to happen, right? And which it did even before the Korean War, right?
Right. And one of the things you can see, I know we're always hesitant to give Kim Il-sung credit, but he could already see the tensions between the Soviets and the Chinese forming pretty early. So a lot of what he did was to stake out, like, say, maybe Yugoslavia is another case of this, or Albania is another case of this, a kind of third position that was in line with both China and the USSR, but siding completely with neither because they were, quote, self-reliant. Now, why is this ideology popular in the initial? Well, because it's successful, and I don't think people understand this. During the transition from the Re to the Park dictatorships in the South, South Korea was one of the poorest nations on the planet. North Korea, while it had been bombed, and I think people don't know how bad it was bombed during the war.
And they described it like very similar to like Europe, and they took more casualties than the bombings in Europe.
Oh yeah, imagine Dresden, but instead of it just being one city, it's most of the country. The worst is in a place called Wusan, which is basically leveled. But interestingly enough, during the first Kim period, they rebuild cities and they modernize them pretty quickly. They use Soviet technology and good trade deals with the USSR and China to build fairly large cities with at the time cutting edge infrastructure. That infrastructure has since degraded, although the idea, for example, that Korea is like this dark mass where there's very little electricity and it's basically like still in the 19th century is other hogwash. It was modernized in the 1950s.
They even beat, and I always love talking to Europeans because they always say you could tell a politics of a country or their economics through soccer, and they beat Italy in the World Cup, right?
Oh, yeah,
I think in 71, I think, or
right.
Italy
and during
was
the same year, Ethiopia was sending South Korea food. Like, just to put it in perspective.
Okay.
So
wow.
So, the reason why the Kim regime is popular is it manages to avoid getting sucked into the Sino-Soviet conflict while maintaining the protection of the Soviet nuclear umbrella. It also has
because the United States had already, as you knew, and that's why you're mentioning it, in 1958, the U.S. Places nuclear weapons in Korea, and it's actually against the armistice. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, the reason why they do this is because also, yes, there's illicit nuclear weapons placement in South Korea. Another thing I think, if we're talking to veterans, that they should maybe be mad about is U.S. policy in this time is to build large stations on the border in Seoul, particularly the now closed base, the kind of infamously now closed base in Itaewon in the center of Seoul in the Foreign District. The purpose of that base was not strategic. And I've had several soldiers just tell me this outright. It was to get blown up and thus commit the United States to the war in case of hostilities.
Wow.
That was the design.
So there are all these. There's all. Can you mention a couple of these other things that are tied to Cold War Korea that a lot of people may not like understand? That's not really covered in the show. Something like that, because that does affect.
There's
your deployment in Korea.
Right. If you're deployed in Kunsan or in the Air Force and Naval bases in Korea, you are there for strategic reasons. But if you're in Itaewon or when that base was open, you were there kind of as a suicide base. Now, if you're a soldier, it seems like a cool deployment. You're in the heart of the city. You're in a party district. It's not a very hard post now. But it exists there for a reason. And in fact, also, the North Korean state, and not North Korean state, the South Korean state.
My friend was stationed there. Yeah.
the South Korean state actually builds the cities of Paju and develops, pushes a lot of development to the north of Seoul, also to serve as buffers during the war, not so much to commit them to the war, but to just create cities so that North Korean tanks, if they somehow got through the demilitarized zone, would immediately hit an urban environment, which would slow them down. So the entire country during this time period is designed and mobilized for war in the South and in the North. The North really doesn't ever demobilize. That's why there's the military first policy. And when their poverty really hits, comes from two things. One is not the cause of the United States, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, they're kind of like Cuba in that they're kind of floating alone in the early 90s. They don't have many trade partners. They don't even have good relations really with Dengist China. They have okay relations with post-Soviet Russia, but not great. And that's when they had already begun to fall behind during the economic development period of the 70s. Now, the US stance on this is also hard to comprehend because on one hand, there was a policy developed in the mid-1970s to kind of economically develop Korea as fast as possible in the same way that was done to Japan, kind of in the idea that if we come off as benevolent in managing this post-conflict situation, that our need to support dictators and whatnot just won't be there, and we'll have continued loyalty through business transactions. But there's also an internal movement within the US at the same time to push back on Korean manufactured goods because they're cheap. Now, this actually, this leads to stuff like a textile ban on Korea. This actually, ironically, is part of how Korea gets so much foreign capital into its economy and really develops in the 1980s. And that is because it starts exploiting Bangladesh. To get around our trade embargoes on Korean textiles, they move a lot of their textile plants to Southeast Asia, modeling, and I think in the 80s, or in the 70s, modeling what we would later do in the United States ourselves to move textile plants into South America and to China post the Dengist reforms, to lower their costs, but primarily it was just to get around region-specific trade ratios and embargoes. Which
so that covers that one side of the acceleration of South Korea and
right.
the decline of North Korea, and that the other factor would be the other main issue that contributed to the decline of North Korea is
bad weather, and then
the famine thing.
Right.
I don't really understand the famine.
So if you are trying to make your own food self-reliantly in a near autarkic state region, autarky for your listeners is a state that doesn't trade with outsiders. And sometimes South Korea will try this too. What will happen often is that you'll have a drought. And Korean land in both the South and the North is not particularly great farmland. There's a reason why it's like lots of meat, lots of root vegetables, lots of cabbage, lots of pickled things. It's not, it's hot in the summer, it's cold in the winter, and the entire peninsula is covered in mountains. So like there's not a lot of arable land. And they had done agricultural reforms and done really good with them, actually. But when they lost the ability to trade for things like fertilizer and stuff with the 90s with the Soviet Union, and they don't have, Russia has its own problems. Russia has the mass die-off in the 90s. It has, by the mass die-off, like 40% of adult men just died during the post-Soviet period from alcoholism and from lack of healthcare and from poverty. The transition in Russia is brutal, so they're not in any state to help North Korea if they wanted to, and they're not super inclined anyway. they see them as tied to communism, and at this time in particular, the Yeltsin and early Putin regimes are trying to move away from that. So but they still have work deals. So the other thing that changes is the liberal parties of South Korea, while they maintain the anti-communist doctrine and the national security laws, had something called the Sunshine Program, which was if there were work exchanges with the North, that there might be liberalizations of the economy and politics, and it would keep the worst case scenario of famine happening. Well, two things happened that in the Sunshine Policy last time. So the Sunshine Policy gets a lot of pushback.
It's pushback, but from what I've heard, it's I think even Cummings says that it was somewhat effective, right?
No, it was effective. So here's what happens. You have the Kim Dae-jung administration from 1998 to 2003, which
South Korea.
of South Korea.
Nobel laureate. He won a Nobel Prize.
Right.
Yep.
Who really starts to push this project of joint economic projects in North Korea with South Korean businesses to kind of liberalize the economy, and open up relations a little bit in under the agreed framework. However, what stops this is North Korea is accused of having nuclear weapons, with some legitimacy, to be honest. Their
delivery system, though, right? Like,
like, but it was technically a violation of the agreed framework. They're put on the Axis of Evil list, and you start getting pressure from the Bush administration to the various liberal Korean administrations to take a harder line on the Sunshine Policy. So you have it working kind of well between 1998 and 2003. It start under the Roh Moo-hyun administration. It starts to get some problems, and there are some significant, like, diplomatic games. For example, Roh's one of the only South Korean leaders who went to a joint summit that actually traveled from Seoul to Pyongyang, so you had open travel through the demilitarized zone. And you have mutual agreement on this, but Roh's party, the Uri party, which is kind of a left liberal party, loses the 2008 elections badly, and between that and the increased U.S. pressure, what begins to happen is the Sunshine Policy breaks down. The summit that was supposed to happen in 2007 is postponed, and I think I said that Roh was the first. Actually, Kim Dae-jung is the first. I got them confused for a second. But Roh is going to make this trip. It doesn't happen. There is increased concern over Korean nuclear weapons, and there does seem like there's nuclear testing. When the Lee Myung-bak administration takes over, it's a right-wing Korean political party. They end the Sunshine Program hard, and then there is another drought, and things get really, really bad. Now, here is the concessions. You already had the U.S. talking about that massive starvation in the North pretty early on. So while the Sunshine Party had decent diplomatic effects and some amelioratory uh, development effects, as in foreign capital to buy food, was injected into the economy, and North Korean money is not worth very much. What really starts to happen is towards the end of Kim Jong-il's reign, is the conditions of the U.S. embargo, the collapse of the Sunshine Policy, and a series of national disasters. Plus, and I will also say North Korea's military first policy does not also accelerates this problem. You
Because
have
one out of every 22 North Koreans is in the military, and
right.
it
You have
really is a
universal.
garrison. It's a garrison country.
Right.
So
Even Cummings and Susie Kim, who are both who try to at least contextualize the situation in North Korea, will tell you that it has universal male conscription for 10 years, which is even longer than the South. South has universal male conscription too, but universal male conscription for 10 years upon reaching adulthood. That's the longest service in the military that's required by the state on the planet.
that tends to influence the culture, right? So there's a militarism that really limits. So it's not so much this whole communism or whatever that's limiting the country in many ways, but you can also say the militarism is limiting
right
the country, right?
right and what the reason why, even despite the Sunshine Party, what North Korean political leadership starts to decide is that they're afraid that they're going to be kind of sacrificed by the South for economic reasons, and that the United States is going to more or less Saddam and Gaddafi them. They'll overthrow the military structure. There will not be a settlement. There will be no way to settle with the South. So reunification is, while formally still the prime directive, I mean, like, it's literally the name of the party of the state. It's the Workers' Party, but the United Front is the United Front to unify the Koreas. But in reality, Korean reunification is more or less given up. What happened?
Okay, go ahead with that, because I want to go back to the Korean War, because I think it's great, because people know like what is happening now, and some of the stuff that we spoke earlier about pre-Korean War, and now we could go back to the Korean War. But what were you about to say?
Well, what feeds into the situation now, and why Korea, by the way, has not just collapsed from its own internal problems, is that in the last 5 or so years, Korea has been liberalizing its economy with market reforms, but they are only with countries that will ignore the U.S. sanctions and embargo, and that is with China and with
Iran, right?
and Iran, and with and Russia, so that doesn't happen until Kim Jong-il dies. It happens under Kim Jong-un. It's one of the panoply of reforms that we know about. The problem that I'll say, even though, like, I have Korean ties, I read Korean, I will sometimes even read actually, it's easier to get this information in the United States than in South Korea, because it is censored in South Korea. You can read Korean newspapers in English if you want to. The problem that North Korean newspapers, the problem that you have is that this bunker mentality is now been instantiated for 3 generations. The poverty of the the real poverty for the North Koreans does not hit until 1992. And while South Korea does, when we talked about it in the 80s, it does overcome the North in its economic prosperity. The North doesn't fall apart till the end of the USSR, really. And the increased tensions between the between the United States and Russia that really kind of start at the end of the Bush administration and really pick up in the Obama administration, also feed into this scenario where the DPRK is able to increasingly turn to Russia for a lifeline in exchange of liberalizing some of its production. Now, that does not mean that there's not a lot of total control there. I mean, like, there's not, the internet's not there. There's almost no access to outside media that isn't at least Chinese. But the idea
but it's not like this Jordan Peterson
it's not one large concentration camp. It just isn't.
Right.
And that's where I think the U.S., like, it's not a state you'd want to defend. I will say that. Like, I'm not one of these people who will go to bat for the DPRK, but it is more of a very paranoid, increasingly cut off, and very poor barrack state. It is not irrational. And I think these are points that the podcast we listen to make good points to. It is responding to what it sees as the geopolitical incentives of its survival. And it also sees the aftermath of Iraq and Libya, which, as most U.S. veterans probably know, is a shit show. So it's, even if Kim Jong-un was inclined to be more liberal, and in some ways he might have been, he was educated in Sweden. Like, he was not isolated. He knows the Western world. He went to an international baccalaureate school in Sweden. So this is not a man who does not understand the rest of the world, and he's not an irrational man by anybody's capacity. In fact, the situation with Trump a few years ago, I actually considered it interesting because I thought that Trump accidentally hit on some Korean cultural traits. So for example, spitting back crazy rhetoric to the Koreans would have been seen as taking them seriously, and they responded in kind. That's an oversimplification. We can become culturally essentialist here, but it is true that, this is not like bluster and hyperbole is part of Korean speech in both the North and the South, and it would have been received as a way for both parties to assert themselves but save face through a backroom deal. The fact that deal could not be made is a problem. And again, this also is tied into the back and forth between left and right politics in the South. As you know, the kind of center-left government of the South has taken hold after the second Park administration. So I'm not going to get into all the complications of that politics because you want me to go back and talk about the Korean War, but has now closed that back off because we have another right-wing, very anti-North government. And so we're likely to see an escalation in nuclear testing, etc. Not because they probably actually intend to use the weapons,
but more because of almost like performance. What a lot of Westerners, and correct me if I'm wrong, they don't understand that, like, the Koreans are something in between, like, the Irish. I don't know. I don't want to simplify this, but they're more, a lot of things that in Chinese culture and in Japanese culture, kind of like honor as far as like being quiet to a certain extent, or there's more like music, Korean music, the folk music is more, you know what I mean? It's much more lively or soulful than some of the other, music's in the area, right? And so performance is very important,
right?
Like you said earlier about the language, like, whatever, when Trump says Rocket Man, whatever, Yun takes it as, whatever, I'm gonna say something else, and I don't know, performance is very important, I think, in Korean culture. And I think that testing could be, to a certain extent, it's misunderstood as more like almost, if I'm dealing with the unconscious here as a psychoanalyst, almost as like exposing a certain level of wanting help but not asking for help
Mm-hmm.
because of its vulnerability. But I don't know, add in to some of that, because I
Well, I mean, there is a sense in which, the Donald Rumsfeld line about, stop me before I kill again, he's making a joke and he's diminishing the situation, and the way escalation is happening with the North, which it definitely is. But there's also a sense in which you have a country that during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was doing very well, and has seen all of that collapse, fears that outside influence will cause it to further collapse, fears that even its southern brethren will take advantage of it economically and basically turn it into, cheap labor. I mean, there's a real fear that I've even heard from North Korean defectors, that elements of the chaebols, the big corporations in the South, would be willing to do to it what they did to Bangladesh, and
they, what they did to themselves after the
right,
Japanese occupation in the
correct,
South, right? Because it's in the South, right, during the Korean War. And I'm glad we're talking about all this. And if our viewers, if you're bored as far as understanding pre-Korean War and post-Korean War dynamics, you're really missing out, because a lot of this is tied directly to the Korean War in particular. But everything that you just said about the Bangladesh thing and these chai balls, you pronounced it better than I mean, that's what happened in the right before the Korean War and throughout the Korean War to control wealth within the
mm-hmm.
elites, right?
Right, exactly. And so you had the formalization of power in a fairly few families. The chaebo system is corporations, but they're family owned. Most of the families were established before even the Japanese occupation, and some of them are seen as Japanese collaborators. So there's that, and there was a sense in which the poor, like, wealth in Korea was extremely unequal during the and to a little bit lesser degree the Park dictatorships, and that ending in the 80s, in the late 70s and early 80s, you have beginnings of Korean prosperity, around the model kind of like post-war Japan, but I mean, there's a lot of things, like the capitalism in South Korea is brutal even by American standards. I mean, most people, like, people work 80 hours a week. Like,
yeah, and so this is something, going back to the Korean War, that I picked up from Cummings, and that is, Cummings says that Korea, there, first of all, you've got this issue of inequality, limited wealth distribution happening even before the Korean War, during Japanese occupation, where Japanese laborers during the occupation are making 3 times more than the highest paid laborer in Korea.
correct.
So that's a huge tension. And so then the Japanese are sent out, after World War II, and then you've got Americans basically allowing kind of like those collaborators to kind of take on those jobs, and the economic labor tensions, what you're saying, as far as the typical workday, this brutal work labor environment, like I can't help but to think that there would be people that would sympathize towards so much hard communism, but definitely socialism, unions,
Well, there
these,
are,
and
but I mean,
communism too.
I
But
mean, well, one
look at
Korean
the
unions,
conditions, though.
Korean unions are militant in the South to this day. Another thing I would say is that you really have to, like, there's a reason why like shows like Squid Games and movies like Parasite come out of the South. Like, there's an internal critique of Korean capitalism that's coded. And is it communist sympathetic? It's hard to say. It is socialist sympathetic though, but they don't use those words because it's illegal. Like, yes, the South's censorship is strange. For example, if you can buy communist books in Korea in English, but you probably can't in Korean, to some degree. And their enforcement of the national security laws and the anti-communist laws are arbitrary. They don't enforce them very often, but when they do, it can be draconianly. And so there is an internal left-wing movement. The other thing
but people don't understand is that all those things, and I'm glad you mentioned that, also stem from the control of the U.S. military government on Korea, right before the war. Like that you've got American military advisors like pushing a very anti-communist
right.
Well,
I mean, the first thing
push, which is okay, but at the same time, when you start accusing everybody, it's like the McCarthyism from the United States ended up like going to Korea, right before McCarthyism.
Well, in 1948, we talk about this. Really begins the conflict. Is the Jeju massacre. Jeju is an island in the South. It's historically a very poor island, although now it's kind of a tourist island. It's a vacation island. It's like Korea's Hawaii. But in this time, it's a very poor island, largely peasant. Its culture is distinct from either the North or the South. It has its own dialect of Korean. Still to this day, actually has a somewhat. There is a unionization and communist sympathetic movement, although not allied to the North at all. This is before that happens. And the re-government initiates what is effectively a near genocidal massacre on Jeju Island. And the purges in the South were extreme, which I think is often missed.
And in many ways, like what some would say, actually the beginning of the Korean War, and that's why that's why I think you mentioned this island, because a lot of people think Korean War starts July 1950, but in reality,
I think it really starts in 1947 as far as the Koreans are concerned. This leads the northern nationalists who are communist sympathetic to disobey Stalin. I mean, Stalin does not want them to try to reunify the country. That's something, the move is Stalin's acceptance of the North Korean communist movement is reluctant, which I think is often missed. And yet, yeah, I mean, what really begins to happen is the Korean People's Armies cross the border into the South after being kind of antagonized, not so much by the U.S. directly, but by the re-administration, because the re-administration also explicitly states, despite U.S. admonition to the contrary, that it also wants to unify the North and purge the communists. And MacArthur, in particular, is okay with this. Truman and Eisenhower are not. But Stalin personally, for example, from, say, 1947 to 1950, tells the North Koreans, no, Do not, do not cross the parallel.
That's right. That's right.
Both he and Mao Zedong separately but concurrently give their blessing in 1950. But the hostilities really begin with the Jeju massacre. That's when Kim Jong-il, not Kim Jong-il, Kim Il-sung really decides that they have to act, and
seeing the return of the Japanese, also the U.S. military, and this show is not like anti American, anti Korean, anti North Korea. This we're talking. We have our sources. We've got Susie Kim, Cummings, even Halberstam, books really
Stokesbury
credible
doesn't deny
books
this
are,
either.
huh?
Like Stokesbury, who's much more sympathetic to the South, doesn't deny any of this either. So it's like this is kind of agreed upon history.
The only one who's really like anti this, kind of like what we're saying, and he has no real, I don't find, I've read his stuff, Alan Millett stuff out of University of New Orleans, right? But then again, a lot of the stuff coming out of that, the Stephen Ambrose stuff, and I know you listeners love Stephen Ambrose, I do too, I love Band of Brothers, it's great, but at the same time, I want to have like different views on different historical events, and it's important to study those to have a richer understanding. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is you're creating the scene here, and I'm also adding as far as like why would Kim Il-sung want to rush down? Well, he's seeing former Japanese sympathizers appointed as military officers along the DMZ, including the future Park Chung-hee, right? I think the show goes into some of that, but what I find very interesting is that urgency is because he's basically seeing a repetition of the Japanese presence, but disguised with U.S. military. And
right.
Again, I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying that because it's not that I back him. I know my dad says, he served in the military. He did his thing.
There's international. There's also international things going on that cause this.
Okay.
Because one of the things that really pushes this is the UN recognizing Taiwan, which causes the Soviet Union and China to boycott the UN. That's when, in that absence and in that non-cooperation, and that is when basically that event takes these local events and really begins the Cold War in earnest. Yes, the Cold War had been building since 1945. Yes, it's been building under the Truman administration, but when that happens, and then Truman has to send a fleet out to protect the Taiwan Strait, that's when things really accelerate. And so you have this internal context. You have this context that's been building since the Japanese occupation. You have these religious tensions, which I don't think get covered well enough I
want you to finish that because I cut you off with the religious tension. So the religious, the Christians go down south.
The Christians go down south, but Christians actually initially support the North.
Okay.
It is when the North declares itself an officially atheistic state and starts suppressing Christians as possible foreign agents. Something that gets into the ambiguities of the Kim family, because people might not know this, but the Kim family come from missionaries themselves. So there's a particular tension there. And so you have a lot of these priorly Northern supporting Christians moving into Seoul, and changing their politics changed radically. Now, a lot of these Christians are also sympathetic to the U.S. And like Christian missionaries also increased during the war. But remember, Christianization in Korea does not come with the United States. It came with Catholics 400 years prior. So it is not a new force in Korea, and Korea has been religiously divided forever. Buddhism, while it's the dominant religion of the country, is still kind of seen as an outside religion. Neo-Confucianism, while it is Chinese in origin, it's actually more rigid in Korea than
So
it is in China.
what could the series say about that more, as far as how it's connected to the war? Because I get to see, I get what you're saying. I just want you to go a little bit deeper into that.
Well,
Because
so what that really creates is a body of defectors who feel betrayed by the North, who
side with the South,
and then also ask for additional American missionaries to help them Christianize against the godless communists. And so that
changes
reinforces the cultural situation. And they have historically been more aligned to the north of the country. To this day, the southernmost parts of Korea are the most Buddhist, even though, Japanese Buddhism comes from Korea. It actually comes from China, but it comes from China through Korea. Right. But the strongholds are like in Busan and stuff in the south. The major temple of the Choge order of some Buddhists is in Seoul, but that is a post war development, because the other order, the Taegu order, is even in the South Korea seen as too collaborationist with the Japanese, and so that plays into this. So you have this bastion of like Korean preachers, and I know this partly because my Korean aunt from Daegu, which is in the center of Rock, she was one of these preachers, and then I learned more about Korean Christianity and its original relationship to the north of the country. Now today, according to Korean official records, and who knows what's true, there's only about 2% Christians, and there are 4 recognized Christian churches, as I said. It is not while the country is formally atheistic in its government, it does not have a total ban on religion. That's a myth. But it, like China, it has state approved and non-state approved religious organs. So there is that. So that's a real tension that really comes to play in. And it's also a cultural tension, like I said, in the South itself, because because one of the differences between the Rhee dictatorship and the Park dictatorship, and then later again between the Lee Bak government and the Park II government, Park's daughter, who is elected president in 2013.
Who was the first president sent to prison, right?
Right,
like in the world or something.
Well, I mean, there's other presidents been convicted of corruption. They generally
but
kill themselves.
like in a democratic, formal,
but the difference between those factions of Korean conservatives is one is Christian and one is Buddhist, and so that still plays out in the different factions of the government. That's also kind of a point of disunity in the South itself, and so you have that. And so this really, the North is devastated, and it's U.S. soldiers who say this, that like they had bombed the cities in the North so thoroughly that they couldn't find targets anymore. That comes from U.S. soldiers. That's not Korean propaganda.
Napalm. People think napalm was Vietnam. The sadness of this war is that there's no in my communications, public affairs in the military studies, they even recognize that there was no real active media going in between the United States and what was happening in Korea. So a lot of things that were happening in Korea, for example, the high levels of atrocities, rape, rape was like epidemic, like what you were saying about the bombings, bombings of civilians. These things, Cummings calls it really the dirty war, not the forgotten war or the coldest winter war, but really kind of like a dirty war, right? Because
It's a
it's
very
like the
dirty
first
war.
modern war where it's concentrating a lot on civilians as well
It
as
actually also leads
soldiers.
to racial backlash, not so much against like white Americans, but for example, black battalion units were used to do some of the most horrible things
Well, yeah,
during the
well
war, which led to
they
anti-black
were
sentiment in both
yeah,
the North and South.
yeah, they were sent, the 24th Infantry
Right.
was sent on these, they were not given gear because of their race. They were uh they were just treated badly and given these missions, that were like impossible. And yeah, it would, not that it would make a person do an atrocity, but they were all a part of it. But it's even sadder to be in sub that state of subalternity,
Right.
that they were uh more vulnerable to be pushed into doing some of these, atrocious things.
Right. I mean, in the South Korean army, I mean, it's pushed
They
back
were
to
doing it too.
right.
Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you said that. Yes, they were responsible as well. Not all of them, but like you said before, you divided everything up between the economic groups as well as the religious groups. They are going to be in the military and acting out on civilians and POWs who, are not like their religion or,
Right.
their economic group, right?
I mean, and it's an intense war. I mean, I think people need to understand that because despite all these bombings, the Seoul is taken 4 times.
But
MacArthur's not a great. I mean, I
you're
don't
right.
like this is
He's horrible, right?
like the both the Liberation Front and the People's Volunteer Army come in. You have all these Chinese PVA fighters that come in.
They have
Um,
a lot of military background because they fought. A lot of people don't understand, but there was a war in China prior to,
oh yeah,
in
there's the Chinese
between,
Civil War.
right, right. So the United States gets this perception that Asians, again, this racism towards Asians aren't able to fight or anything like that. Even, the narrative of General Aldman, who basically says, we're going up to the Yalu River, and he gives this speech towards the troops, and he says, "You're not going to let like a bunch of Chinese laundrymen stop you, are you?" And it's comments like that really send, the Eighth Army all the way up without respecting the military strength of the Chinese. And not only that, um, it's interesting, but the Marine General O.P. Smith, he's actually more prepared and doesn't. He's against MacArthur, against Aldman, as far as like protecting his Marines. And I guess it is, studied, it's a case study as far as how the Marines were able, I guess, and also they were able to take like 98,000 refugees, from like, I forgot what place in like the Chozon Reservoir area, all the way to the sea, and then leave, but
Mhm.
what you said is right about like MacArthur and everything. And can you say some more about uh just some of the ground war?
Well, the ground war does not go well for the South. I mean, they get pushed back to the Pusan perimeter, which is very far south. I mean, like that's any further off, and they're in the sea heading towards Japan.
This is at the
And
beginning. Mhm.
yeah, this is at the beginning. Um, it is U.S. forces primarily that have the will to fight. Um, on the southern side. On the northern side, everybody has the will to fight, and that tells you something about the Reed government. The Reed government isn't like that different from like the Diem government in South Vietnam, that it doesn't have a lot of popular legitimacy. And this is a problem. I mean, the other thing the other reason why it doesn't have a lot of popular legitimacy is the Reed government is purging people that we know of. There's at least 10,000 South Koreans killed by the Reed government, suspected for being some kind of infiltrator, and the U.S. is in on that as well. And so the will to fight,
it doesn't inspire a strong cadre of military in the South, even though later on it might, through what's happening now in Ukraine, once the United States gets fully involved and has some time to kind of groom these troops, they start, it starts happening. But even then, like you said, it's still problematic because they have problems with the very weakened government.
Right. Well, I mean, you have, by the time you get to like April 51, because the most intense fighting on both sides is in the first year, you effectively have the U.S. forces push them back up to the line, and then you're at a stalemate for 2 whole years, from July of 1951 to July of 1953. Like, there is very little ground gained by either side. And I mean, the battles here get fierce. I mean, I think some of the more known ones, one that I think my grandfather fought at was the Battle of Heartbreak Ridge. There's the Battle of Hook. There's the Battle of Port Trap Hill. There's the Battle of Kum Song. They're bloody, they're fierce, and they don't go anywhere. And I think to understand, the armistice is signed partly because, well, Stalin dies. Right. You already have tensions between. This is the beginning of the Sino-Soviet split. There a lot of the issues that in the war, and I think this is also poorly understood by Americans, is one, Eisenhower realizing if MacArthur gets what he wants, we're going to have World War III. 2, that there are beginning to be tensions between people who uphold Stalin's figures as a key figure out of loyalty to him for support during their revolutions, and the actual Soviet Union itself after the secret speech. So once Khrushchev gives the secret speech, which is not secret at all, it's like broadcast to the fucking world, to the world. It really starts dividing the situation, and that's when Kim Il Sung starts pushing Juche, self-reliance, which is picked up from the period of fighting against the Japanese. That's when the sort of, we are allies to both China and Russia, but we are not subordinated to either one of them begins. That's when a lot of the things that we think of today start to happen. But I also think people need to understand, you had these hardened anti-communists in the South. The reason why my uncle had a Korean wife, he didn't fight in the Korean War. He's too young. He fought in the Vietnamese War because we used Korean soldiers.
60,000.
Yeah. And I can say this having been to Vietnam. A friend of mine likes to remind me, like, the reason why the Vietnamese don't hold the Vietnam War against the Americans as much is because they won. And they don't, actually. Like, if you go to Vietnam as an American, even though it's still a communist country, you're not going to be mistreated. But they hold a grudge against the South Koreans because, again, we use them as to do things that we didn't think American GIs could do.
Well, I compare it to, like, we have these contractors, in Iraq, like from Uganda, Colombia, these like really seasoned fighters, and it's just like you let them go. You know what I mean? And in many ways, yeah, you're absolutely right. In Vietnam, in many ways, they were not under a lot of Geneva Convention rules,
Right.
because of their status, supposedly,
So one
as,
of the
as
things
advisors.
one of the things that people need to understand too about why the armistice was so hard, the armistice is signed in 1953, but Syngman Rhee refuses to sign it.
Oh,
So
wow.
the UN recognizes the armistice, and the People's Volunteer Army recognizes the armistice, and the Korean People's Army recognizes the armistice, but technically the South Korean army does not recognize the armistice. So, it the so this is part of why there's a justification in the North to remain on total mobilization pretty much forever, because they see the South as, being more recalcitrant than the Americans, and while the USSR is not directly involved, and the People's Volunteer Army of China is like, okay, we're done. And even the KPA is like, okay, fine, we'll sign the armistice for now. The UN forces, which is 90% American, say, yeah, sure, we're on the armistice. We don't want this to bleed over and cause a world war with nukes. The Syngman Rhee government refuses to sign the agreement. They more or less refused to recognize the accords initially. That gets a lot better after Operation Glory is conducted in November 1954, and there's an exchange of the dead, and the exchange of the dead of people who died in prisoner of war camps, and there's the establishment of things like the unknown soldiers in the United States, and this goes to build some goodwill between the two forces. And by 1953, 1954, there is the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission that really comes in and maintains the armistice, and the demilitarized zone, and also because of the tensions between the Chinese Communist and the USSR, there is less direct involvement of China with North Korea's affairs. Also, by the time that you deal with Cambodia and Vietnam, the communists are effectively kind of torn on which side to side with the Chinese, and by proxy the Americans, siding with the Cambodians.
Right, because I mean, what the Chinese get involved with a border war with Vietnam right after the Vietnam War with the United States, right? I mean, it was for a year or so. But yeah,
and China has several other wars. There's almost a war with Russia. There's a war with India during this time period.
I think you've been able to kind of like go into pre-Korean War, post-Korean War, go back
now
to the
Korean
War, and then go back. This is a great hermeneutic, and go back to the present, because I think that a lot can be said about this, and before we end, because I don't know if my producer, I know I could talk to you for 5 hours about this. I don't know if my producers, I don't know if Cindy's gonna knock me out or whatever, but I'm pushing this. But no edit, Cindy. It's going straight. It's going straight. But can you give us some last words and also talk about your vlog, and also talk about maybe some of the future episodes you're going to have on the
Sure.
blog, so that people can tune in and subscribe and listen, because I really want folks to kind of, we had Ariana Peccary from, she was the whistleblower who wrote the resignation letter at MSNBC, you know, uh, about a year ago, just kind of like exposing MSNBC in regards to their, redundant use of the news and the corporatizing of the hyper corporatizing of the news. So we had her kind of talk about media education, and I just think, you know what you offer is a great resource for media education. And sometime in the future, I'd like to do a show on media education with you, and just talk about that for vets.
Mhm.
But like, can you just say some of the things that I just asked you to say?
Sure. I'm doing a solo series on my channel called Nailing It Down, which is about understanding logic, the way logic is abused, and particularly in media and social media discourses. Um, I am doing the European scholar Ralph Ruckus is coming on to talk about the communist road to capitalism. I've also had Dong Ping Han on, who is a defender of the Cultural Revolution. I've had Elijah Emery and Daniel Tutt to talk about the American historian Christopher Lasch and
Hmm.
the left-wing critiques of the left in the United States, and that series is still coming out. I have had Beatrice Adwood Bolton talking about disability and global health problems, and how current policymakers just don't seem to get it. I've had the scholar Carolyn Eichner talking about women and revolts from the Paris Commune and into the decolonial movement in France. I've had uh, the anthropologist Joel Wainwright talk about various political responses that might happen in regards to climate change. And I've had Sean Comforter. I do a lot of stuff actually more on economics and economic literacy, both from a left-wing perspective, so your audience knows, but
But
uh,
people also don't realize, weren't you like a paleo?
I was a conservative. I was a
Yeah,
paleo conservative, yeah,
yeah,
for
yeah,
my
which
in my
means
20s.
like the most authentic, or how could I say it?
Old
In
school kind of
this
conservative. Yeah,
old school conservative. That's what like gravitated me to Derick shows, because I saw one show where he's like explaining his background as a paleo conservative, and I gotta
and I'm
listen to
also,
the
unlike most leftists, I'm from the deep South, even though I don't sound like it anymore.
yeah,
Uh,
you were you like teaching or
I
doing
taught
something at North Georgia College or something, or
No, I
near
taught
there?
at Georgia College, not North Georgia College,
Okay.
but I was a public school teacher in Central Georgia for 3 or 4 years. I grew up mostly in the Deep South, um, and I come from a family that worked in prisons, and a lot of my extended family and my grandfather, two of my uncles were both soldiers, so this is a world I am familiar with. And I will commiserate with soldiers that a lot of the modern American left doesn't really know how to speak to them, even when soldiers are sympathetic. I mean, I pointed out to people that, yes, there are a lot of soldiers who supported Trump. There are also a lot of soldiers who supported Bernie Sanders. So I realize that the military is much more varied than like liberal pictures of it are. I also realize that, frankly, soldiers, even conservative soldiers, are generally more cautious about war, with some exceptions. Yes, there are always hawks, but for the most part, people who've been in war are not super ecstatic to go back.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so these are things that I really care about.
Yeah, and I think when he says left, he means
I mean,
more as far
socialist.
you're
Yeah.
a socialist, yes, and I have social Christian, uh, like a Cornell West background. When they ask him, "Well, are you a communist?" No, I can't. Are you Black Panther? No, I can't because I believe in the gospel. That's how I am, but I take on a lot of uh, the socialist thinking, and I believe in the social gospel because
Right.
I don't believe that Christ just came here to my personal belief, just to kind of like be a show and whatever, and not be involved in the lives of people's uh economic future and political future. So
Yeah, and
yeah.
unlike a lot of socialists, I am a strict secularist. By that I mean I don't think we should mess with private religious belief. And so I'm a little bit iffy on whether I might tax churches though. But
I think they should be taxed.
yeah,
There's I believe they should be, and it could be kind of like what Nixon was talking about, that what's that tax called? What is that? Damn it, what is it,
the
like one?
value added tax or
Yeah, one tax, like one, just one tax. You just pay one tax and that's it. You know what I mean?
right.
Like churches just pay one amount for every congregation, and it's a low amount, but it is
Right.
something that they have to contribute percentage wise.
Yo,
So
yeah, the reason why I feel that way is I come from Macon, Georgia, which has the
you,
most taxes I mean, the most, excuse me, the most churches in the United States. And between that and hospital land, there's no tax base for the city to operate. Um, but I don't, what I would say is I actually don't have a hostility to Christians. And in fact, I would argue that one of the left's weakness is not that we should like pretend that we share values with conservative Christians, because we don't. But we should not be afraid to speak to them, because that's part of the one of the things that I think that's killing our society is that and I don't think this is just politically. I also think it's in terms of social class and a bunch of different things. We are unlikely to deal with and encounter people unlike ourselves. Um, and I think that has not always been historically true in our country. And in some ways, it's worse now than it even was during Jim Crow. And that is something that I think is really detrimental to our culture and to our politics in general.
think,
So.
yeah, and I think that I want to again do another piece involving media education, and maybe we could talk about some of the um things tied to like media in regards to Chomsky or
Hmm.
Marshall McLuhan, as far as how war can be presented in certain ways.
Hmm.
I'd really like that in the future. And so I really appreciate you coming on, because a lot. And not only that, I think you do make an effort to engage people from different backgrounds, and you're definitely aware of the veteran terrain and the military terrain. And so
Yeah, I
thank
feel
you.
like everybody kind of leaves veterans in lurch these days. I
Yeah,
mean, to be honest,
yeah,
that's why
and
the suicide rates are so high.
that's why I created the show, and that's why my research has been involved in readjustment culture, because the power of the movie Rambo,
Mm,
or the song Born in the USA is one thing, but then the readjustment of, let's say, a memoir from someone in the VA hospital in 1968, like Ronnie Kovacs, from Born on the 4th of July, his memoir, that's also important. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
That type of readjustment, not the war, the Oliver Stone, but the actual movie, book, not the movie, but the
Mhm.
actual book, and studying, what was it like to be at the Bronx VA in 1968 or whatever, and yeah, that's just as important. And so when you said that about vets, that's the aim, and that's why I wanted to have you on here.
Yes.
So,
So
so
yeah,
thanks.
thank you
All
so
right.
much for having me on.
Yeah. Hey, I appreciate it. And how can people get on to the to learn about you and stuff? What
Oh yeah, you can look up C. Derick Varn on YouTube and our Varn blog on YouTube. I think it's YouTube/channel/C. Derick Varn. You can go to any pod feed and find the audio for my pod. It's on Stitcher, it's on Spotify. Just put in Varn blog. That's my last name plus vlog. Um, I have a Patreon under Varn blog if people want to support me, but I try to keep all the main interviews free, and the solo shows are free on YouTube, although they're only on YouTube for non-subscribers. But yeah, I make a lot of this free, most of it free.
and I look at, yeah, and I look at it this way as far as supporting, on with a lot of people, I don't endorse it, but with you, I do. Ben Burgess, I do to a certain extent. He and I are, I'm waiting. There's something, you know, I basically criticized what's that, the Navy SEAL Crenshaw on, he was kind of downing veterans on disability, retirement. And so Ben Burgess and I did like a show on that. But
Mhm.
but I really, some, like your shows offer so much information that it's like, if you're gonna have like a New York Times membership, you might as well, like, have a membership here. It's a lot cheaper. I'm not pushing anything. What I'm saying is that,
Yep.
you put in a lot of research towards the information, and it's definitely not simpleton kind of like
No, I would say the one caveat I would say is the interviews can sometimes be a little bit daunting for newcomers depending on the topic. And so I warn people about that. But the short videos, which are all available for free on YouTube, are deliberately made to be accessible. But they're mostly about some of it's political punditry. It's me complaining about Democrats, but a lot of it is me talking about media literacy, logic, these, what people do and don't understand about the right or the far left, or what Marxists actually believed, and then what different groups have. All these kinds of things are things that I cover.
and that's very important, because what we get from the Times or the Post, we're just getting the flash of these topics, but not a good understanding. And
Yeah, yeah,
what
I would say, like, for example, in North Korean coverage, sometimes left liberal Democratic sources are worse
Yeah.
than right wing sources.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
particularly in the last 10 years.
Yeah. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon. And this
Yeah.
is it. You can also check out other shows like this through the Coming Home Well network by just going to cominghomewell.com. Thank
Okay.
you, Varn, and
Thank you.
have a great night.
You too.
Veteran Etc. invites you to join us again with your host, Mike Kim, every Sunday. If the content from this podcast is informative to you, please share the podcast with others. Give a like and/or post something you learned from the episode on social media. If interested in other truly informative podcasts like Veteran Etc., check out cominghomewell.com for a listing of other veteran-based podcasts. Thank you for tuning in.